Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Community Television. Chapters is the show that allows me, and by extension you, to get up close and personal, shall we say, with authors, editors, and publishers literally all across the country. I'm your host, Carter Seaton, and it's great to have you with us today. And it's also wonderful to have Sarah Sullivan with us today. Sarah is the author of picture books, novels, and poetry. Her picture book, Passing the Music Down, was an N.C.T.E. notable book, a nominee for the West Virginia Children's Choice Award, and a Bank Street College Best Children's Book. Her novel, All That's Missing, received a starred review from the Bulletin of the Center for Children's Books. Her poetry has been anthologized and has appeared in Cricket Magazine and other publications. Sarah holds an MFA in writing for children and young adults from Vermont College, where she was awarded a Harcourt postgraduate scholarship. She now lives in Williamsburg, Virginia with her husband, but I met her when she still lived in Charleston, West Virginia. Welcome, Sarah. Good to see you.
Carter, it's so good to see you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. I don't think we've had a children's author on the show before, so this should be really fascinating for our readers and our listeners. You live in Williamsburg, but where did you grow up?
Well, that's unfortunately not an easy question. I'll make it as quick as I can. My father worked for DuPont, so we moved a lot. So I was born in Fairmont. We then lived in Wilmington, Delaware briefly, Birmingham, Alabama for about 6 months. So I did half of kindergarten in Delaware, half in Alabama, and then we were in Huntington. And I actually went to Camac in Huntington for first and second grade. And I have the best memories of that experience. It was wonderful. We then moved in the third grade, and I was in Littleton, Colorado for 8 years.
Wow.
So, and then when I was halfway through high school, we moved back to Wilmington, Delaware.
You have been across the country.
Gypsy a little bit.
So it's fair to say, I think, that your books are for children, but what age group?
The picture books generally are for ages 4 to 7, thereabouts. Arguably, Passing the Music Down is for all ages, all different ages enjoy that book. And the novel is 8 to 12-year-olds. So I'm really, most of them are about from ages 5 to 10, somewhere in there.
So the novel, is that considered middle grade?
It's considered middle grade. Yeah, a lot of people are confused, and understandably so, at the distinction between young adult and middle grade. And the lines blur there. But the idea is that middle grade is that sweet spot of what we would think of as 4th, 5th, 6th grade, maybe 7th. And young adult is then maybe 8th or 9th grade and up.
I got you. Okay. So they're not all picture books. You've got, are the preponderance of them though?
Pardon me?
The preponderance of your books are picture books?
They are. They are.
Okay. Yeah. What drew you to that genre? Or
You know,
why did you study that in school?
It's interesting because honestly, my first love is the middle grade segment, middle grade fiction. I think because maybe I became a real reader at that age in the 4th or 5th grade. When I started reading chapter books, that's what really hooked me on reading. So that's where I started, and that's where I really started writing. But I also always loved poetry. And most of my picture books have some degree of poetry in them. They really start as poetry oftentimes. So I think that those are kind of the avenues that drew me into this.
Okay. Tell us just a little bit about a few of your books. I know you've got a whole wide range of them, but tell us about a few of them.
Okay. Well,
particularly Passing the Music Down.
I'll hit that one last. I'll talk briefly about the others because I'll really want to focus on that one because it is really a West Virginia book. But my husband has suggested maybe I have a hang up about siblings, because if there is a theme, 2 of the picture books involve sibling rivalry, and there is a little bit of a family question issue that drives the plot in my novel. So Once Upon a Baby Brother, which people might encounter, it's actually in a 2nd grade reader, McGraw-Hill 2nd grade reader. It's about a little girl named Lizzie who's in the 2nd grade. Her favorite thing is making up stories. She doesn't realize that her inspiration is her brother, Marvin, who drives her crazy but she turns him into a man-eating fish and a dinosaur. And so he's really the source of inspiration. So it's a story about where stories come from. And I
Mhm.
like to use that when I go in and do writing workshops with second or third graders, because I tell them, you all have story material. Just by getting up in the morning and
Right,
dressed and going to school, you
right.
have story material. So that's where that comes from. The other Dear Baby was another book that's similar to that. But then passing the music down was really, I mean, they're all labors of love, but that was more than the others, a true labor of love, because it was inspired by two real people. And that was Melvin, excuse me, Melvin Wine,
Right.
Braxton County, and Jake Crack, the two old time fiddle players. And so that's the one that really, also because I was celebrating and honoring two people, and it wasn't anything about me. It was just trying to honor people that I admired.
Mhm. Can you tell us a little bit about the story between the two of them? I know it, but I want you to tell us.
Sure. Well, what happened was, and many people in your audience may know this, but of course, being in West Virginia, we're surrounded by all kinds of traditional music. And so I lived in Charleston for more than 30 years. And I used to go to the Vandalia gathering on Memorial Day weekends, and I always enjoyed hearing Melvin Wine play. He was a famous traditional old time fiddle player from Braxton County. He had the music was passed down in his family. And so one year there was a young man playing with him. And there was an article in the Charleston Gazette about that relationship between the two of them. And it turned out it was Jake Crack, who is now living in Marlinton and is a young man in his 30s. At that time, he was a boy. And the story is that he was growing up in Indiana and he just sensed this calling toward traditional music and real authentic old time music. He had a teacher who was teaching him bluegrass, but he really wanted to learn the true old time music. And so that teacher gave him recordings that included music by Melvin Wine and Lester McCumbers and some of the other traditional fiddle players. And he said, if you really love this music, you should get your parents to take you to one of the festivals back in the mountains, because that music is passed down by oral tradition. And when those old timers die, the music will go with them unless someone learns it and passes it on. And so Jake's family brought him to Clifftop, to the string band festival at
Mhm.
Clifftop. Jake was 10. He found Melvin. He met Melvin, and Melvin said, you know any of my music? And so Jake played a tune he'd learned from one of those recordings his teacher had given him. And Melvin then invited Jake and his family to come visit him on his farm. And over the next 2 years, they did that. Ultimately, they moved to West Virginia. Dara, Jake's mother, took a job as the children's librarian at Charleston Catholic. And for 7 years, Jake and Melvin played together until, and this is the part that just kind of gave me chills, in the spring of Jake's senior year of high school, and that was when it was 7 years, Melvin suffered a stroke. He was about a month shy of his 94th birthday, so he had had a long, full life. Um, and he passed away, and Jake was holding his hand
Oh,
at the time and promised to pass his music down, which was the only payment that Melvin would take for teaching his music. He wouldn't take money for that. And so Jake then went on to do that.
what a
So
wonderful story.
it just seemed like something out of legend to me, and I felt like it needed to be told.
Oh, I agree. I totally agree. Some of the other books, you have one called A Day for Ice Skating,
A Day for Skating, yeah.
A Day for Skating. Does that come from any of your experiences, or is it just totally imagined?
No, it comes from experience. For years, I wanted to write an ice skating story because when we were living in Colorado, just up the street from us, there was a pond. And when it was frozen in the winter, we could ice skate on the pond. Well, the first time that happened, my father, who was never an outdoorsy athletic kind of person, and he was by that time probably in his mid 40s, he knew that they had made preparations for people in the neighborhood to skate on the pond. And so he went down in the basement and pulled this dusty pair of ice skates out and said, we're going skating. I had no idea he could ice skate. I was probably about 9 years old at the time. And he grew up in McDowell County. So he had ice skated somewhere in McDowell County. I don't know where. Um, but we got up to the pond and we started skating, and I was rather hesitant, but he said, "Would you like to see a figure eight?" You could have knocked me over with a feather. I had no idea. So he did a figure eight. And that was such an important memory to me. It was a surprise, one of those things when your parents just
Yeah.
totally surprise you. So I always wanted to tell a story about a child skating with a parent, to try and honor that. And this was, to be honest with you, the story I told is the third or fourth try at it. Several stories, and this is the one that somebody finally wanted. And so I was very excited to be able to.
That's great. Now, that book came out in late 2019.
Just
how-
before the pandemic, yes.
I was going to say, how did the pandemic affect that launch?
I was so lucky because it came out in the fall, and my last travel, I was in Alexandria, Virginia, and Silver Spring on Thanksgiving weekend of 2019, and then I took the train back to Williamsburg. That was it. That was it.
Yeah, right.
So,
Wow. I think probably a lot of people don't have any idea about the difference in the process of getting a picture book published and, let's say, a novel. Can you talk a little bit about that and how the illustrator's chosen and who does it and all that sort of thing?
Sure, and it is very, very different. Picture book is really a collaborative process. Lots of people don't know that normally the publisher selects the illustrator. So what happens is I will work on the text and work with my editor to polish a text. And then when she feels that it's done, we'll talk about what kind of style of art might be appropriate. The publisher will then offer samples of artists who might be available and whose art might fit the story. And then they send the text to the illustrator. And if the illustrator is interested, then they would agree to illustrate the story. That process can take anywhere from a couple of months to years to find an illustrator.
Wow.
And then once the illustrator agrees to do the book, they usually have a year to do sketch art and then another year to do the final art. And the book has to be done a year before it's actually published.
Wow. That's even longer than a novel. That's surprising.
Oh yeah, and it can be, and so depending on how available the illustrator is, it can be anywhere. The fastest is probably 18 months to 2 years, and that's if you just zoom through it. Passing the Music Down was 5 years from my finishing the manuscript to the book, because Barry Root, who did the gorgeous illustrations, here it is. I was so fortunate, and he had photographs, by the way, so that's very similar to a photograph of Melvin's farm that I got from the cracks. But he had 2 books ahead of mine, and so I had to wait my turn basically before I could do.
Now, once the publisher has chosen an illustrator, do you have any veto power, let's say? Once somebody's done, say, some of the sketches, if you think this is really not working for me, do you have the right to say, let's try again?
Well, they will send, the first thing I'll see sketch art. The very first thing I see is page turns, because I don't even decide the page turns. The book designer at the publisher does that. The next thing I see is sketch art. And at that stage, if something seems really just off, they want me to say something about it.
Okay.
In most instances, if it's all fiction, the idea is that the illustrator brings a completely independent creative vision to match with the text. And so they are very free to do whatever seems appropriate based on how they're inspired by the text. And it's not, it's rare that I would ever have any comment on that, because there's no right or wrong. In this particular instance with Passing the Music Down, the publisher was very concerned about the hands on the fiddle looking correct for people, and asked me, and of course I have no idea, so I actually shared the sketch art with Jake and his mother to make sure that there was no problem with that. So that, where it's necessary or appropriate, there's some opportunity.
Yeah, I can see that with a day for skating, that would be the illustrator's, inspiration as to what he sees, whether it's a pond or a skating rink or, depending, of course, on the words you've
And,
included.
and that's a special example of what a collaborative process it is, because a lot of the storytelling in that book turns out to involve interaction with the dog that the child has. And that was not in the text at all. That's purely the illustrator's imagination and addition, which only amplifies the story. It just makes it fuller and richer. So that's why people say, don't you hate that you don't get to pick the illustrator? And no, not at all. And I don't ever talk to the illustrator. Even with passing the music down, I never communicated directly with the illustrator. But I don't mind that at all, because it's such a delightful surprise to see what they come up with. So it's all,
Has the same illustrator done any two of your books? It's all
No.
been different.
They've all been different. Yeah.
Well, it gives you a different look to them. I think that's a good thing, probably.
It does. It does. And it's something to look forward to see
Sure.
what they come up with. So
Right. Are you working on one now?
I'm working now on 2 middle grade projects, and probably as a result of what we've been through over the past 18 months, I've kind of dipped my toe more into the fantasy side of things. I think partly because I felt like everybody needed a break.
Yeah.
Things, and partly just because it was just an opportunity to do something different. But it's not high fantasy. I'm not a world building,
Mhm.
not that kind of fantasy. It's more like magic in the real world kind of
Mhm.
fantasy. So one thing has been fully written, and several people have read it, some editors, and I'm revising. Nothing set in stone to be published yet, but it's something coming along, I hope.
Do middle grade books have any illustrations at all?
That's kind of in flux right now, because there is a huge growth in graphic novels now.
Yes. Right.
A lot of a lot of readers in that age group really love graphic novels. That's not something that I do. I think that largely is almost like writing a script or a play. But I think because of that, and because we all are more visual now because of all the time we spend online, there is starting to be more spot art in middle grade fiction that's narrative and not a graphic novel. So, for instance, Kate DiCamillo's book, The Beatrice Prophecy, which just came out a few weeks ago, Sophie Blackhall, who's won 2 Caldecots, did the art for that book, and it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. So I think that's a welcome addition. When I was a child, I think the texts were longer, but there was also more use of illustration in long narrative pieces. And then there was kind of movement away. So now it's kind of creeping back a little bit.
Well, even when you look at, say, Treasure Island.
Exactly.
There's, that's N.C.T.E.'s claim to fame.
Exactly.
So books did have illustrations back then.
They did, and they were gorgeous. And
yeah, they were. They were beautiful. Yeah. Right. So All That's Missing, that is a middle grade book.
Right.
Is there any art in it?
No, it's strictly middle grade book.
Okay. But and the protagonist is a young boy, right?
He is, yeah. It's a boy who's 11. He's on the cusp of turning 12. And it's he's being raised by his maternal grandfather, because his parents died in a car wreck when he was 2. And his only other relative is his grandmother on the other side of the family, who lives 300 miles away, and whom he knows his grandfather isn't crazy about, but he doesn't know why. But he senses something happened. And he'd like to understand really his family and where he comes from. He feels like he doesn't really know. And his grandfather is beginning to show signs of dementia. So he understands, his name is Arlo, he understands that something's going to have to be done, because if people at school or the authorities find out that grandfather's in this kind of trouble, they're going to take him away. So he sets off on a journey to find the grandmother on the other side of the family and discover the true story about who he is and where he comes from. So that's what it's about.
What inspired that book?
Well, it's not the same story at all, but I know exactly where it came from. When I was growing up in Colorado, we lived 2,000 miles away from any other family. I only had grandparents on my father's side. My mother's parents died before I was born. And one day, this is the shameful admission. One day, shortly before Christmas, I was going through my mother's drawers in case there might be something she had tucked away as a Christmas gift, because she'd been known to forget things in the past. So I thought I'd save her the trouble and make sure she got everything into the stockings.
Right. Good
So
thinking.
I found her jewelry box, and I looked in her jewelry box in a bottom drawer, and there was a very yellowed Western Union telegram. And so I opened it up, and it was addressed to someone named Mrs. Sarah Glenn Coble. Well, her name was Sarah Glenn, which is my name. Her maiden name was Glenn, but I didn't know who Coble was. Though I had seen that name in some old books on our shelves that were old Book of the Month Club books. So I opened the telegram, and it said, "We regret to inform you that your husband died." And I was about, I think I was 11, something about the age of the boy in the book. So long story short, she had been married before, and her husband died during World War II. And my much older brother, who was 13 years older than I am, we actually had different biological fathers. He had been born during her first marriage, and his father had died, and then my father adopted him. Well, nobody had ever told me. I mean, it didn't really change anything, but it changed everything, because suddenly at that age, everything I thought I understood about my family was wrong.
Right.
And so it's a years-long process of figuring that out. So that's where it came from.
That's good. I like that idea. You also write poetry.
Yes.
Is that aimed at children, or is that like adult poetry?
It's aimed at children. No, it would be dreadful if I tried to. I mean, I love adult poetry. It's gorgeous and I love it. But no, it's tied to the picture books, because frequently when I start a picture book, I just automatically tend to want to tell the story with some sort of rhythm or meter, not necessarily rhyme, but and I want to use as much figurative language as I can. So that's where that comes from.
So have you ever written a poem and then realized that you really want that to be a book, a children's book?
Sure, yeah, and sometimes it works out. I did one that I still love and nothing's happened with. It's about mountains, and it was during mountaintop removal when that was such a big issue. And I got all kinds of comments on what lovely language was, but it wasn't enough of a story for anyone to want to do anything. So.
Do you move from one genre to another purposefully, or is it something that just inspires you to, out of the blue, says, no, now you need to move on to a middle grade book?
It's more just what comes to me, unless I'm attending, like maybe getting together with a group of writers, or I go to some sort of conference, and then it's, and that's more likely to be working on a picture book or poetry, and someone will say, and you know this as a writer, when you're around other people, oftentimes if you're doing some sort of exercise, something floats up out of nowhere, and it's a great idea, and you probably never would have thought about it if you hadn't been in that place with those people.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Did you always want to be a writer? You went straight to college for that reason. So did you attempt it when you were a child?
I did, as a matter of fact. I used to write stories when I was a child. And part of that was, we moved all the time. I was basically growing up as an only child because my brother was so much older. So when you move to a new neighborhood in the summertime and school hasn't started yet, you're entertaining yourself.
Right, exactly. Right.
So once I could read, I just read constantly. And once you're hooked on reading, you want to tell stories yourself. So that I know that's where it comes from.
Right, exactly. What's your writing routine? Do you try to write every day?
I do. It was a whole lot easier before my husband retired. I shouldn't say that.
I've heard that from other people.
He's always busy now, but his schedule is not as regular as it was. So I need to be a little more flexible, and basically because I can revise and I can do some work when he's here, but it's so much, you're always anticipating an interruption, and it's easier if it's, there won't be one, and you can just really, because I lose track of time. If I'm really working, I have no idea how much time has passed.
But you do all your writing at home?
Well, unless I have to be traveling, but yeah, I'm much more productive at home. I like to be in a comfortable place, and yeah, it's much easier for me to do it that way. I mean, the room I'm in now is a room over our garage, and it's incredibly quiet here. We call it Narnia because you can only get into this room by going through like a 3.5 or 4 foot high door in the back of a closet.
Oh, fantastic.
The closet, open the door and come in here. So you kind of feel like you've left the house.
Yeah. Did you buy the house for that reason?
No, but it did turn out to be pretty nice. So the person who had this house, not immediately before us, but 2 people before, was a ceramicist.
Oh.
She actually had a kiln in this room, and she actually created all kinds of ceramic tile in here. So the kiln's even more good.
Right.
There's some creative vibes in the walls, I think.
Sure. So do you also do a lot of reading now?
Oh yeah, that's my passion. That's what I love more than anything else. So, and you hate to say this, but honestly, during the pandemic, if you write, it's not a huge lifestyle change, because I spend a lot of time.
You're still going to read and you're still going to write.
Exactly.
Yeah. What are you reading now?
Well, I thought you might. People always ask, and I never have anything, so I came prepared. So I'm not reading right now. I'm waiting for Elizabeth Strout's latest book, O William, to arrive, which I'm dying to read because she's one of my very favorite writers. But recently, this is the book I just mentioned earlier, The Beatrice Prophecy by Keith Capello, illustrated by Sophie Blackhall, and it's got these lovely.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful.
And we were talking about design a little while ago. So we talked about the writer and the illustrator. The book designer has a lot to do with this, and she's the one that kind of was guided by William Morris, an inspiration for a lot of the design of this book. So that's but this is a beautiful book. It's a wonderful story. Last year during the pandemic, and I may even read it again this year, I loved this book. I don't know if you've read this.
No.
Wintering by Catherine May. It's nonfiction. It's sort of series of personal essays. It's largely about, she had a period in her life when all kinds of terrible things were happening. Her husband was terribly ill. Her son was struggling in school. She was having problems. And so it was the idea, if we go through these wintering periods in our lives, when we sort of have to retreat from the world to restore and take care of ourselves and our families, and how that's just part of the natural process. And there's actually growth potential in that, and a lot of richness in that to draw from. It's a beautiful book. She has all kinds of things she includes from history, from anthropology. It's beautiful. She's English. So I really recommend this all the time. And then the other one, last year, one of my all-time favorite reads, you've probably read this, Hamnet by Maggie.
No, I want to. It's on my list.
It's fabulous. It sounds like it would be really kind of a downer. It's the story of Shakespeare's son who died at the age of 10. He was a twin, but it's just a fabulous book. It's very, it's uplifting. It's really not depressing at all. And the ambition of the book is so impressive to take this on, but she really pulls it off. It's a beautiful, beautiful
That's
book.
great.
So there are 3.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun to talk to you. It's the time has slipped by already, and I appreciate you being here. It's been great to visit with you again, and I hope everybody has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Until next time, I'm Carter Seaton, your host, saying stay well, stay tuned, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. And bye, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to see you.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.